Good Monday morning to you. As we continue to bridge our Can You Relate series and this time of Advent, I'm going to continue this shift in focus as Pastor Tom did last week, with really just diving into the beginnings of what it means to expect Christ, the long and expectant Savior, that we constantly use that phrase. In church, you might remember that we're focusing on this theme of from the cross to the manger, rediscovering Jesus. And the reality is that no matter where we are in our faith life or faith journey, what our experiences might entail, we always have more to learn. God always shows up for us in a new way, opening our mind and our understanding, allowing us to better see, better understand, better appreciate how God might be at work in the world. And I think a beautiful way of doing this is to focus just on that first chapter of Matthew. So this week we're going to start, by the end of the week, we're going to start getting into the characters that precursor Christ and are part of Christ's very early days in this world. And that's going to carry us through this month of December as we are so close to Christmas. We're already in that second week of Advent. But today I want to talk about Matthew 1 and genealogy. And you might at this point think, well, I think I'm going to turn it off. Please stay with me for just a couple more minutes. Because to look at Jesus's genealogy is to remember that God had a very specific plan. I think that the one thing that I always grab onto when I don't understand anything else and when I can't make sense of the world and how God is at work sometimes in such a broken world, I go back to Matthew 1 and I realize that while there's a lot of chaos in this world and there's a lot of things that we bring about because of our own sinful behavior and actions, God has always had a plan. God had a plan of redemption all the way back in Genesis when he calls Abraham under the stars and he tells them your ancestors will be as numerous as the grains of the sand. God had a plan as he went through the generations. You think about the wandering in the wilderness, that time of Exodus, when the people didn't even know where they were going. God had a plan for them and was leading them until they established in the promised land, and then the greatest king that Israel ever knew, that of David. David becomes the cornerstone with which everything else is built. And as we've been going through our Can You Relate series, especially over the last month, you've heard that constant theme of whether the person was faithful or did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. And there was that thread that continued to be woven throughout the Old Testament narrative. And that thread is really important. In fact, the fruition of that thread comes in Matthew 1. Matthew 1 is the non-traditional Christmas story, the genealogy of Jesus the Messiah. The writer of Matthew is writing to the Hebraic community, trying to remind them that Jesus is not a random character, is not just a person who comes declaring things without being able to fulfill them. Jesus has purpose. Jesus has been part of God's plan since near the beginning of the time, and now Jesus will continue that fulfillment God promised long ago. In the opening chapter of Matthew 1, just in that first verse, Matthew names two very specific characters that are part of Jesus' line. Jesus, the Messiah, son of David, son of Abraham. Now again, when you're speaking to a Jewish culture, who your parents are really matter. I often like to make the common association is, when you come from Norwegian countries, you are the son of, right? And that's how we end up with so many Johnsons and Paulsons and Stevensons and all those kinds of things, right? Because you are the son of, and that's how your family lineage, your family tradition carries. Well, this is very true in the Jewish culture as well. Son of being Abraham, son of David is connecting, is solidifying that you have authority, that you have status because of who your parents were. And of course, Jesus isn't the direct son. We think in our modern times, we think of immediate familiar patterns. I don't know if we care as much about the second cousins and third cousins and who's removed and who's part of our line as much as we used to. I think about, at one time my dad sat down with people in our family and he wrote up the tree of who had come from Prussia, Germany, and how many generations had actually lived in this country. And there was a lot of details on that. Well, now I could go on to Ancestry 23 or one of the other ancestry sites, and I could have a little saliva go on a tube and it could come back and it could give me percentages of where I come from. But that initial work that my dad did, that initial tree with all of the papers and all of the details and showing how there truly was a connection from this place to this place and the span of time that connected those two, well, you can't mimic that work. And that's what Matthew is doing. Matthew's putting in the time, he's putting in the work. And much of what we read from verses 2 through 10 are actually recorded in First Chronicles. But Matthew likely didn't have First Chronicles. He likely knew many of the details because he was part of an oral tradition. And to be part of an oral tradition, you don't have to have it written down. You just know it so well that you can recite it. It's one thing I lament about our modern Christianity, that we don't mimic previous Christianity, and certainly the roots in Judaism, where the oral tradition becomes foundational to who we are, that we can just recite and navigate that without even thought. But verses 2 through 10 of First Matthew, bring in that chronological, that order that we've been actually talking about for the last several months. In our Can You Relate series, if you read 2 through 10, you're going to see a lot of the characters that we've already covered. And we're going to talk a little bit, and you're going to hear that refrain of how God was at work. And what I love about Matthew 2 through 10 is you don't only get like the good things like David, right? And Solomon, although they both had flaws in their characters. You also get, Uzziah and Ahaz and Hezekiah, and how some of these other more deeply flawed characters were part of God's story as well. In this first day of kind of connecting the dots and bringing us into that understanding of what Advent's all about, I want to highlight two things. Jesus is from the tradition of Abraham, and he's from the tradition of David. Abraham is connecting to the people. To say that Jesus is son of Abraham is to speak into the generations of faithful Israelites. It's God saying to the people, I gave you this plan. I have delivered you through the generations. The stories and struggles of old are still your stories and your struggles. And now I'm going to send a leader that is directly tied to that. Jesus, being son of Abraham, grounds Jesus in the people. But Jesus, being son of David, also creates a royalty out of him. It elevates his status. He is son of the greatest king that ever existed for the Israelites. So in this first verse, in this first act of Matthew is establishing Jesus' authority for the people and through the royal tradition. He's celebrating that he is homegrown, as we like to say, that he has that same bloodline that we all carry in our faith. But he also has status. God has specifically used specific leaders throughout history, those who have been faithful to him, to bring about this Messiah. On day one, it is a great reminder of how God has very specific plans for all of us. Our lives are not predestined, that we know everything that's going to happen from tomorrow to the next day, to the next month, to the next year. But just like God was at work in all of the generations between Abraham and Jesus, God is at work in you and in me. God has work for us to do, and God has a plan and purpose for us. So today on this Monday, I hope you find a few minutes, read through the names. Read through the names and see how many of the stories you remember from where we've been focused the last couple months. Read through the names and see if there's a name that makes you want to look something up about them. Google's a wonderful thing. You can actually Google the name and what is something that you didn't know about one of the people that play a role and being part of the genealogy of Jesus. It's kind of a neat exercise to do on this first Monday in the second week of Advent. Look forward to continuing this process with you. Have a great day.